welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Let's call this part 4 of Mussolini, an Italian American perspective. Okay, so we have gradually progressed in the series that I'm doing. Part 1 starting with, of course, the nuances between, how classical liberals see fascism versus how the communist left sees them. And I've kind of, you know, gave some clarity and context with some of the mistakes in trying to relate sort of fascism with what's happening in current day politics in America. On the second cast, I did a compare and contrast between fascism and communism, highlighting how the comparison between the two seems to be off, as the blood list and the mountain of bones that communism was built upon, fascism never had anything close to that. And of course, in the last episode, I covered the relationship between Mussolini and the church, which is fascinating in and of itself. And today I want to talk about fascist economics. And so this is where I'll start with this, because with the economics, this is the creme de la creme, right? In this left and right battle of modern liberalism now, right? You have the far left, communist left, that talks about how the markets or the means of production needs to be consolidated by the state, versus the right, which tells you that, well, no, we need to get into the hands of capital. And we've had this sort of war to the death for the past 200 years between the left and the right. And this is the battle that we've always been stuck in America. And essentially, it reflects why we have so few choices at the ballot box. It's a two-party system based upon these two ideologies going back and forth. And it's what we've all been reacting to as Americans now for a long time. It's only when you step out of that box can you see that there's actually other options and other ideas that have floated around throughout history that have never been given the light of day. And primarily because World War II brought an end to all those ideologies, right? It was classical liberalism and communism that combined forces together to beat back, again, what would be other options in the sphere of governance and, of course, economics as well, too. Fascism was an attempt to find a third way. It's why it's called the third way. And how fascism presents itself in many ways was a middle ground in between communism and capitalism. Now, of course, as we'll get deeper into this, the question, of course, everybody asks is, was fascism legitimate in its style of governance and ultimately in its economics theories? And that we'll never know the answer to, because it was never given the light of day. Like I said, classical liberal world of the West and the communist world of the East came down on it, crushed it, make sure it would never rise. And especially from the communist left, we've had a propaganda campaign since the end of World War II to malign fascism to such a degree that to make sure that nobody ever thinks about reviving fascism in any kind of way. That's why you can't call yourself a fascist in this world. Nobody will. It's interesting, again, these interesting anomalies, you want to call them. In America, you can call yourself a communist, right? Bernie Sanders, for many years, called himself a communist, got elected into Congress as a far left communist. But fascism, you really can't use that label. That's how badly it's been maligned. And as you see at the top levels of the university systems, not just in America, but all over the world, communism, far leftism, very popular. It's consumed all the institutions. We know now that at this point in history. But as far as the fascist ideology, listen, I'm not going to get into the theories of the philosophy of governance for fascism. It's still something I'm trying to grasp, right? It's a lot of it's a lot of talk by the philosophy aspect of it, primarily with Giovanni Gentili, what a lot of the fascists believe, how the world view. All I can tell you in general is that they were running away from this purely material world where everything is about economics, everything is about productivity, everything is about the material world, which the left and the right, the capitalists and the communists, have been having a showdown, a death to the battle over now for 200 years. Fascists saw that there was a problem, that these basically capitalism and communism were two sides of the same coin. and they were calling for something bigger. They called it a spiritual awakeness that encompassed history, tradition, language, culture, and even, as we saw with Mussolini, he brought in the church eventually, which was interesting. Now, I think the big question with fascism is, how serious was it? Because it was born out of a liberal society, and in many ways, a lot of them were ex-Marxists and ex-socialists that began to run away from Marxism. It was an ideology like capitalism and like communism that was born out of man's made ideas, right? Just like communism is a secular ideology, capitalism in the West is a secular ideology. Initially, fascism was a secular ideology too. And you're like, okay, well, communism has fallen based on this secular ideology. Capitalism has fallen because of this secular ideology. What makes fascism any different? Since it's born of it and it kind of borrows from both sides of the coin in many ways. That's where I find Mussolini's introduction or the Lateran Accords different, because Mussolini was very malleable in his ideology. And the moment he breaks rank with the fascist philosophers and brings the church into the fold, whether it was divinely inspired or his intentions were altruistic in bringing in the church, or whether it was a strict political move on his part, really doesn't matter, because he does bring in the church. And when he brings it in, he gives it real power, right? As we talked about in the last cast, he gave the institution of marriage to the church. He gave the schools to the church, the hospitals, the orphanages. He put the crucifixes back in the classroom, banned divorce and remarriage, banned contraceptives, gave the church real power, making it the integralist voice, the integralist faith of Italy. After the 1929 Lateran Accords, we can debate whether he was being, aggrandizing for his own power. I get that. But he does give the church real power. And that's a game changer, because he had to break away from sort of some of the fascist ideologies. And I believe it was Gentili that was arguing, we can't bring the church into the mix. Fascism has to come first, and religion has to be independent. But Mussolini, for whatever reason, did bring in the church and gave it power. And to me, that's a game changer, because now fascism, after the 1929 Accords, and while the church and fascism still do butt heads, don't get me wrong, it's not purely a secular ideology anymore. It's not. See, in the communist East, they simply killed off religion, right? This was one of the concerns of the church when it was trying to decide, okay, whose side are we on here? Are we on the Nazi side? Or are we on the communist side here? Because the communists were brutal against people of faith in Russia, and of course, out in the East, in that area over there, they burned down something like 24,000 churches. They were killing priests and bishops and people of faith over there. They had a real concern. And so they ultimately suppressed violently Christianity out in Russia. That's what the communists did. In the West, they took a more indifferent approach, where it wasn't overtly oppressed, but the indifferent nature of a Protestant nation mixed in with Masonry kills the faith slowly. And as we've seen, America and Britain and all of the Western nations linked sort of to the Anglosphere over the past 200 years, the faith has died. It has completely died, because they've never been able to solve the issue of what is true and what is false. Everything has become about, again, dialectic materialism. Is that the term that I believe communists use? And both sides focus on this and this emphasis of materialism, right? If you ever listen to Rush, like I did for so many years, he basically highlighted the greatness of America. And what was it? We spread freedom and liberty in order to be prosperous, right? That's why when America was going to places like Iraq, one of the talking points of the right was, listen, we don't want to kill you. We want to do business with you. Sure, we may have to kill your leadership, your tradition, your history, all of that. But once we're in there, we're going to want to do business with you. We'll live better lives financially and economically, and you'll live better lives financially and economically at the end of the day. See, that is what America has always focused on. And it does go back to our Calvinist origins, right? The Protestant work ethic that made work and ultimately money and materialism into a part of the Christian gospel that never existed before Calvinism. Well, maybe in some odd sects, but it definitely wasn't in the old Catholic world for 16, 1700 years. And that's where we get, sort of this heresy. And you see this ghostly past still in America today that emphasizes that work is the greatest virtue. It's not sin. It's not fighting or controlling our fallen nature, trying to control our passions, our fallen passions, or our or anything of that nature. It's about making money. As long as you make money, you're a good citizen in America. Your religion, your faith, yeah, there's some good things there you should follow, but they're not a prerequisite to proclaim you a good American, right? This is why we can have pornographers in America being celebrated at death because they achieve not only a standard of liberty that the world's never seen through their license of pornography, but they also achieve financial prosperity, and they provided jobs for young ladies in the porn industry. I mean, this is how the logic eventually works out on the right, especially the libertarian right? So you have this death battle between these two secular materialistic ideologies, and here comes fascism. And fascism says, wait a minute, there's something wrong here, because there's more to human nature than just making money. There's history, there's tradition, there's language, there's culture, there's all of this stuff. And this is what they were trying to find. And that's why this what do they call it again? That's why Mussolini rejected what he called the bourgeois spirit that focused maturely on man acquiring wealth and material goods. This is why fascists focus on things like sports, or they focus on things like technological advancement in a personal sphere, right? Because it was trying to find a balance between, again, the common good and personal rights, right? Individual rights. While the other two ideologies, communism completely squashed individual rights, capitalism squashed the common good, fascism was trying to find a balance in between the two. And I will admit that's tricky how you do that, because you need somebody in a position of authority to make that decision. And that's why democracy can't work in a fascist nation, right? But then again, you look at the totalitarian nature of communism, they can't solve the issue of individual rights and ultimately suppressing individuals. And on the capitalist side here, in the Western liberal side over here, they can't ever find the common good. So license always wins and moral depravity always ensues in the West. You see what I'm saying? But the fascists came in and said, how do we balance this out? And so that's some of the basic philosophical principles of governance. I'll leave it at that. I'm sure there's other people that can speak to this better than I can. Again, I'm not much in the way of philosophy. I'll admit that. I'm more historically minded, politically minded. I do very well, as you guys know, following this podcast, with sort of this left and right dichotomy, the war between the left and the right. I can analyze that. But deep historical, deep governmental philosophy is something that I'm a little slow on. I get the basic gist of it, don't get me wrong, but there's others that can explain it better than I can. So when it came to economics, again, what the fascists saw as the problem between, again, the classical liberal in the West and the communist in the East is they both saw this war between labor and capital. And labor and capital are always fighting against each other. In the East, they favor labor at the expense of capital. In the West, they favor capital at the expense of labor. And this constant confliction at the time was causing wars and strikes. There was abuses in the system itself. Workers were being abused, backdoor deals, governments being bought out by, wealthy, multi-billionaire kind of oligarchs at the time, at the turn of the Industrial Revolution, that led to corruption, backdoor deals, shady stock, all kinds of corruption during the days of the robber barons. Well, in the communist East, it was total repression of everything of an individual nature, and nobody owned anything, which was the opposite extreme. But the fascists come along and they said, you know what worked well for us? The old medieval guild system. That's what worked well for us. And the medieval guild system was part of the old Catholic world. And it was crushed, ironically enough, by the French Revolution. but it worked well. And the difference being with the medieval guild system was that it didn't view capital and labor as enemies. What the fascists tried to say was, listen, why don't we bring these two together to represent the entire industry, to do what's in the best nature of the industry? How is that going to happen? Through the corporations. Now, what are the corporations in Italy? Are they Apple? Are they Google? Are they Walmart? No, they have nothing to do. They're not commercial corporations. This is where the confusion of the classical liberals, the political right, comes in, where they say, well, the definition of fascism is the collusion between corporations and the government. That's simply the definition of fascism, is what I've been taught, right? But that's the communist interpretation post-World War II, after the fascists were defeated. And nobody wanted to hear anything about what they were trying to do anymore. Communists took over Eastern Europe, right, and a large segment of the planet, and pushed the propaganda. And as we get into the university academic elitist level, they began to redefine what fascism was, not just on the communist left, but also on the classical liberal right, if you want to call it that, because both had colluded to destroy fascism at the end of the day, right? So the idea, whenever you hear a Dinesh D'Souza, a Glenn Beck, who else is there? A few other guys tell you that it is the collusion between the corporation, or should I say corporations and government. Ask them what their definition of corporations is, because I guarantee you they don't know what they're talking about most often, because the corporations were not commercial corporations in Italy. The corporations in Italy in 1920s and 30s, again, based off the old medieval syndicalist guild system, was a political wing of the guild system itself. Let me turn again to Martin Goldberg, right? Martin Goldberg, The Truth About Mussolini and Fascism. He covers this very well, actually. Very short and succinct, but covers it very well. These were the corporations in Italy that they established. Now, let's remember, corporatism, right, which is the economic model of fascism, it really never got implemented. Everybody acknowledges that, because it would have took a generation or two to really make this thing work. They were trying to introduce it slowly, right? I think the best that I can make out is that ultimately what Mussolini was in terms of economics was more like a Keynesian type, right? You tax, you have some infrastructure. I mean, Mussolini went out of his way to set up a lot of these, the modern social programs, primarily sick pay, a pension plan like a social security plan, things of that nature. But see, what is interesting is the war on language that we often play in classical liberal society, because while Mussolini was incorporating a lot of these things like sick pay and a pension plan in Italy, America under FDR was doing the same thing. The difference is the war on language. Mussolini did call himself a socialist. FDR did not call himself a socialist. We call FDR a big government liberal. We don't call him a socialist, right? But in Italy, or at least in Europe, they were more honest about what they were, because there was many different brands of socialism at the time. But it's a war on language here. And because we're always trying to defend these, again, these individual kind of capitalistic tendencies in the West, we dare not ever try and use words like socialism, because that would sort of destroy the credibility of what America has become and how it's succumbed to the very same things that many European nations were succumbing to at that period of time. Again, it's a war of language oftentimes. What were the differences essentially between Benito Mussolini and FDR? I guarantee you Benito Mussolini had a lower tax rate than FDR did, right? And this is where we get the rise of libertarianism after the New Deal here in America, to start to deal with this big government stuff. But anyway, let me get back. I deviated. Let's go back to the corporations here, okay? What were the corporations in Italy? Here we go. There was 14 of them. The Corporation of Stage, the Corporation of Grains, the Corporation of Fruits, Vegetables, and Flowers, the Corporation of Beet Sugar and Refining Industry, the Corporation of Animal Products and Fisheries, the Corporation of Vineyards and Wine, the Corporation of Vegetable and Oils, the Corporation of Paper and Press, the Corporation of Textile Corporation, the Clothing Industries Corporation, the Corporation of Marine and Aviation, the Corporation of Metallurgy and Machinery, the Corporation of Mines, and number 14, the Corporation of Professions and Arts. That's what the corporations were. They were not commercial corporations, which is what conservatives in America are always conflating. From the D'Souza's, from the Becks, from all these guys that talk about it's the collusion between the corporations. No, the corporation in Italy were the political wing. They were actually government structures that were designed to be a broker between capital and labor. So the first objection, I already know what conservatives will say. Well, of course, this corporation is going to side with big business because they got the money to buy out Mussolini and the fascists. Again, you're wrong. This is why Mussolini appealed to all three classes of status of economics: the wealthy, the middle class, and the poor, because the fascists actually brought down the hammer on big business that will not comply with labor laws. This is where they get a lot of the things about, okay, they're bringing down the hammer, they're a little authoritarian, they're a little rough. Yeah, they were, but they were trying to maintain the ideology. They were not, see, you got to remember, they were not printing money in Italy, which finance and international financing and usury and banking politics, that's a whole nother issue that I'll maybe put a link on. I know, who was it? Historian Ryan Grant. I did a thing with Trad Patrick that I think I can still find online on audio that talk about the banking aspect of World War II. And it was a battle that international financiers were trying to come into these Catholic nations who were rejected that. See? So when you talk about, and that in part and parcel, that's what decided the war, is that in America and Russia, they could print money and build a military by running debt. In these more Catholic nations, they were not printing money. And if they were, it's very limited. I don't think they have central banking. But that was part of it as well, too. And so you have a situation here where the fascists simply have a different worldview on how this is to be governed, how society and culture and economics. The question is, again, in relation to capital and labor, could they be brought together? Could there be an unbiased broker in between the two? That was the attempt. And the examples we have is that the fascist government did push back against capital when it began to abuse labor, right? One of the things that Mussolini is actually critiqued for, but it's an example. After the Great Depression, what was happening was a lot of people were being thrown out in the streets from their homes because they couldn't afford the rent anymore. Well, they had, what do they call it? They had actually a jail for landlords who refused to drop the rent on people that were being kicked out. It goes to show you that the heroes did not favor capital. There was instances when they went into factories and, well, they roughed up the owners a little bit there, whether it's right or wrong, when they were abusing their labor law policies. Again, this is why Mussolini's appeal was across class lines, rich, middle class, and poor. And this is the point that Martin Goldberg brought up in the beginning of his book, because his family was of a lower class status, and yet they did not have problems with Mussolini's policies because it appealed to everybody. It seems to me, despite the fallen nature of Mussolini and fascism, they actually did try to incorporate what they believed. The question is, long-term, would it have actually worked, or would it become just as corrupted as capitalism has become and communism become? Probably would have. Man's fallen nature, it is what it is. But again, I think the game changer, which makes everything fascinating, is, again, Mussolini brought in the church to help temper that fallen nature. Now, whether that was legitimate or not, bringing the church in was for altruistic purposes, we can debate that. But the fact is, he brought the church in, and that matters at the end of the day. So whenever you hear classical liberals talk about what's the merging of the state and the corporations, they really don't know what they're talking about half the time, because we've seen the economic policy, what they were trying to do. They were mimicking something of the old world. Now, I think the other problem here is the definition of the state. I think one of the things you'll find is how there's a famous quote by Mussolini. It's something like, I'm paraphrasing here, I got it in the book here, I just don't want to look it up, but it's something, everything of the state, everything in the state, nothing outside the state, right? Which equivocates big government in the eyes of American conservatives and classical liberals. But again, you have to understand the context of European politics. What the right in America is not the right in Europe. In fact, The right in America, from sort of the dictates of post-Enlightenment society, is actually a liberal movement. See, Catholic societies don't have to work within the framework of small government. They can, and it's suggested that Catholic governments operate in small kind of, in small scales, whether they're states or provinces, whatever you want to call them. But Catholicism is very malleable in terms of governance. Catholicism can be infused into monarchies, confederations, fascists, democracy. So in that sense, what the state is in Italy, and yeah, they did have a strong change because it was a monarchy at the end of the day. That doesn't make it, how should I say this, a far left nation, because certainly Italy, with its tidings or its ties to the Catholic faith, at least at a cultural level, is always much more conservative. And again, even the fascist policies of Mussolini, the fascists were much more conservative. You saw out in communism, where they robbed everybody of their individual rights. And in some ways, they were also much more conservative in terms of faith and religion than the classical liberals, who were destroying religion through indifferentism. So we got definitional differences here that are very important to define here. Because a government is big or it has central power doesn't mean it's a leftward movement. That is an American Anglo insecurity. Again, we've been through this because the Anglos rebelled against all authority, first starting with the church, then starting with the monarchy. They equate everything of a big nature, of a big centralized nature, or a strong government to be of a leftist nature. But that's a Protestant insecurity. That is a Protestant definition of what conservatism or what leftism is. In Catholic nations, you can have a strong government. Now, generally, Catholic nations do break down at a local level. Fascism and corporatism did that. What was the state in Italy at the time? It was Bari. It was Sicily. It was Verona. It was Naples, right? Those had their own jurisdictions. They had their own powers within the certain sectors of the economy in Italy. And that was a lot of the ideas behind it. But again, the idea that somehow centralized government or a strong government equates leftism, again, we're talking about cultural definitions here. And so from the fascist perspective, they saw themselves as breaking away from classical liberals and communism and trying to find something in the middle here. Whether they would have done that, I don't know. But at the end of the day, the fascists and the corporatist system was seeking something of the past that was done very well in the old world. The syndicalist guild system, which did a lot of great things, right? It brought labor and capital together. It minimized the wars. It had a broker between the two. It protected the particular industry, whatever industry corporation what was in charge of. It brought the faith into the mix, right? I mean, not only did they have like insurance programs, not only did they regulate trade for the best interest of the industry itself and a bunch of other economic measures, but the guilds also brought in the faith. They all had a patron saint of sorts that would guide the industries and all the workers and the families who were within the realm of that corporation. It was beautiful, right? That's why I say it's like faith and religion were intricately involved in Italy and throughout all of Europe. It wasn't until communism comes around and classical liberal comes around that we start to remove the faith. And as I said before, and I continue to say this, markets cannot run without Catholic morality. They can't. This is why the markets in America today are distorted, right? That's why I keep saying it's not fascism that we have in America. It's oligarchical rule. And it's oligarchical rule because there's no morality anymore to really take care of the common good. Everything is based upon the individual trouncing on the common good, right? To his own personal advantage. Now, the classical liberals say, well, yeah, but the trickle down, and if this guy succeeds and everybody else, say, well, okay, fine, but that's not what we've seen. The past 50, 60 years, it hasn't trickled down. Yes, government has grown, but that's another byproduct of the democratic system, the capitalist system, that allows for the hijacking of the democratic process. So that's not an answer. The fact is, everywhere where liberalism has been tried, governments have grown and grown and grown. And in the lower status, the lower classes have suffered. You haven't solved that. You may have a utopian view, a utopian intention of how things are supposed to be if we just got back to the founding principles. But at some point, you got to be, as Rush used to say, in realville. When you guys get in realville, and when do these things actually work? And if they're broken, what is the mechanism to correct these fallacies within the system? Conservatives don't have that. They don't have that. And this is why they're beat constantly at the voting ballot at the end of the day, and why the economics continue to gravitate toward an oligarchical structure at the end of the day. Will our friends in the political right ever figure that out? Probably not, because they've bought into this left and right dichotomy, that everything is within the framework of this box, political box that they've created because of the Enlightenment and liberalism, and anything outside that is strange. It's diminished. It's just kind of scoffed at, and because ultimately the numbers favor liberal democratic principles, with all these people going to the voting booth and voting at the end of the day. This is what we know. This is how we were raised. It's like a friend of mine told me one time, Frank, America will never be Catholic, so you got to get out there and vote. That's the only chance we have. I'm like, okay, fine, but how's that liberalism working out for you conservatives today? How is it? Not very well, as you continue to be consumed by your progressive siblings. So as far as fascism is concerned, they saw some of these fallacies. Now, did they have all the right answers? I don't know. But what I do favor is, rather than diminishing them and using fake talking points that we've seen from both the left and the right, that we respect history and at least understand what they were trying to accomplish. That's my goal here, right? And it was not a collusion between commercial corporations and government. It was something bigger, more well thought out, and history deserves that respect. Everybody deserves that respect. It's like I keep telling my conservative friends on the right, 100 years from now, if you voted for a Republican, you're going to be a sexist, bigot, homophobe. That's the trajectory we're on now. History deserves much bigger respect than that. And I'm afraid a lot of my friends on the political right haven't done that. They've been lazy to look into it. And ultimately, out of desperation, because of the constant losses, it's easy to create fascism as the boogeyman in order to try and malign and slander their leftist enemies at this point, with the word. Because, see, the word communism is not even a bad word anymore, is it? Fascism is. Everybody throws around. The left throws it the right throws the left. But is communism a bad word? Even though communism's death toll and the mountain of bones it was built upon, it's just astronomical historically. I don't think we ever see anything like it. But yet communism gets away. It's gotten away at the university and academic level, and even at the political level in America. And now, because the word effectively has no meaning, the right has to try and concoct another idea. Now they're using the word fascism in order to try and get some kind of a reaction or implication in this struggle to the death with their progressive siblings who's really are the bastard offspring of the classical liberal revolutionaries. That's the irony of it all. Would a fascism work at the end of the day? I don't know. Man-made ideology, again, just like communism and liberalism and classical liberalism, it probably would have failed, to be honest with you. But at least they gave a little bit serious thought to the problems of the times, where the political left and the communist left and the classical liberal right, if you want to call it that, are stuck in these ideological modes to the death, and they're not solving any problems. And Western civilization now, under the guidance, under the leadership, under the governance of liberalism, of post-enlightened liberalism, is taking the world off the cliff. That's where we're at. Who takes the blame for this? Who? Can't blame the Catholics. And in many ways, you can't even blame the fascists anymore, because they don't exist anymore. So there you go, ladies and gentlemen. A basic economic lecture here. There's a lot more to it. Don't get me wrong. I'm not an economist. I do the best I can with what I read and my basic limited understanding with my own limited abilities, of course. And, I'll probably do another part on this. Maybe I'll cover economics again. I know there's a lot more to cover, but I appreciate you joining me, just trying to give you a little bit of history that I've studied at the end of the day. And there you have it. I want to thank you for joining me tonight. This is Frank, signing off for Frankly Speaking. Good night, everybody.